Omar. Welcome back, everyone, for our second lecture in this 3-lecture series. I want to share a few ideas to kind of build on what we were talking about last hour. We were talking about human rights violations that happen systematically based on race in the United States, and I should say related violations around the world. We know that the abolition movement, the civil rights movement that is ongoing in this country, include as an important component a public theological contest that's emblematic of the struggle to acknowledge the wide encompassing circle of the human family, the community of rights holders, in the way that Christ modeled and taught. So while it may offend our sensibilities today to recognize that there were claims of Christian belief and scriptural interpretation on both sides of both the abolition movement and the civil rights struggle of the 1950s and 60s, we know that that's very much the case, that the voices of faith that stood for justice were and are in the minority and have always had to face biblical interpretations and theological claims invoked to support a status quo that has subjugated entire peoples. The late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. asked how often the church has been an echo rather than a voice, a taillight behind the Supreme Court rather than a headlight, guiding us progressively and decisively into higher levels of understanding. The voices like those of Dr. King that are universally honored today as prophetic in the clear hindsight of history, these have been voices that at times have seemed like a lone voice in the wilderness, challenging those at the center of power. And I believe this is no less true today. I believe the saints who bravely stand and sacrificed for the rights of those who are marginalized shine all the more brightly against the backdrop of institutional indifference, resistance to change, or complicity with oppression. And I just want to take a moment to encourage and acknowledge some of the things that your community is doing at St.Philip Presbyterian in Houston, Texas, to be a witness with the saints to this all-encompassing, all-inclusive divine love and source of our human rights. I understand that your church has hung a banner, a Black Lives Matter banner, there at your sanctuary, and that it has been a point of notice among your community, and that you've received calls critiquing or criticizing, or maybe even worse, from those in the community that take issue. And actually, this relates to a point I saw come up in the chat, which I appreciate. Thank you for the comment that said, if I may sort of paraphrase, in essence, you're really focused on George Floyd's perspective, aren't you? More than a balanced perspective. And that's true. That's true. I'm very much looking at this through his eyes for our current purposes. And I think that can actually illustrate what I was telling you before, that human rights are indeed from the perspective of the victim. That is actually analytically part of what we're doing. We're putting ourselves, situating ourselves in the victim's shoes. And that is appropriate and necessary if we're trying to guard against injustice. And so in the same vein, to make an assertion that Black Lives Matter, it's appropriate, it's important, it's necessary, because we're seeking to correct. We're seeking to correct for a horrific history that denied that fundamental theological truth. And I think it's beautiful that your community at St. Philip has stepped forward to affirm, to make that affirmation, Black Lives Matter, visibly in your community. And I hope that if and when you're challenged on that, maybe one of the things you can say in response is, our church wants to be a headlight, not a tail light. We want to be a headlight for justice. And I think that's what you're doing. So we're turning now to our second lecture, our second topic. This lecture I've entitled Human Rights in Light of Sacred Human Worth. So we talked in the first hour about the love of God, which we proclaim and receive and share week in and week out. We talked about this as the animating force that imbues every life with incalculable worth, which in turn requires us to treat our neighbor with regard, care, and consideration befitting the human being. In other words, to respect his human rights. We said God approaches George Floyd as a friend, desires relationship with him, honors his friendship, and expects us to honor him too. And we said this is no fickle or lukewarm affection. It is the love that the Apostle Paul tells us surpasses knowledge and understanding. A world in which we all respect the divinely bestowed worth of our fellow human beings, it would be a just world. It would be a just world. It would look more like the kingdom of God that Christ preached, proclaimed, and inaugurated. But this world is still more aspiration than reality. It is a promise that has not yet been fulfilled. We live in the now and the not yet, anticipating with hope a world that would be more like the reign of heaven, and hoping that our own nation might be more faithful to the promises it has made to our democratic ideals of liberty for all, of equal justice under law. I want to introduce you to one of the saints who knew this struggle quite well. Perhaps some of you know the name, Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray, who I believe is the unsung heroine of the civil rights and the women's rights and the human rights movement. She was, some will know, a lawyer, an advocate, a scholar, poet, and eventually an Episcopal priest, one of the first women to be ordained officially in that tradition. Pauli Murray grew up in North Carolina. She was a woman of African and European ancestry, a descendant of slave owner and enslaved, and she encountered discrimination based on her race, based on her gender, based on her sexuality. She was quite brilliant, without a doubt, quite brilliant. But the first time she applied to graduate school at the University of North Carolina, they rejected her based on her race and said so blatantly. She did get accepted to Howard Law School and went on to graduate at the top of her class, which usually for the valedictorian there resulted in a year-long fellowship at Harvard. But Harvard turned her down, this time because she was a woman, and it told her so. As a woman of color who did not fit society's expectations, she lived at the intersection of multiple forms of discrimination. And the history books, excuse me, too long neglected Murray's legacy, perhaps in part because she didn't fit our stereotypes in terms of her gender or sexuality. But her contributions were so vital in advancing the measure of greater racial justice and gender justice that our law does afford today. Murray was doing lunch counter sit-ins in Washington, D.C. in the 1940s. And in that same era, she also was arrested for challenging segregation on a public bus, decades before the height of the civil rights movement that we know so well. And the legal theories that eventually Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to secure greater rights for women in our country, those were originally expounded by Pauli Murray. The reasoning cited in Brown versus Board of Education to outlaw racial segregation in public schools, that started with a paper Pauli Murray wrote in law school. And as I mentioned, she was among the first women ordained in the Episcopal Church. She lived at the crossroads between racial and gender bias, and she reflected at times, I am not sure why I am facing discrimination. I can't parse the reasons. Could be one or another or both. So she continually stressed the interrelated nature of all forms of oppression. And she was known for insisting that sex discrimination and race discrimination are both morally indefensible, that all people's rights should be equal. She called the rights of women and the rights of African Americans different phases of one fundamental and indivisible issue of human rights. And she was always seeking to ensure that these different movements for liberation should work more closely together. It reminds me of the Apostle Paul's statement in Galatians, there's no longer Jew or Greek, there's no longer slave or free, there's no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. In that one statement, Paul challenges the three major social divides of his time. He links the abolition of gender discrimination and racial discrimination and religious discrimination all within the same passage. Well, Pauli Murray's conviction about the interrelated nature of human rights, this conviction very much began to triumph on the world stage during her time, during the post-World War II era. And I want to share with you now a little bit of history about this and how the concept we're speaking of, human rights, came to be protected under international law. When the UN was founded in 1945, in the wake of World War II, its founding charter recognized human rights as a concern of the global community and a primary founding purpose of the United Nations. So countries that joined the newly formed UN, they pledged to promote human rights, as did the UN itself. And importantly, a document called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the UN in 1948, it sets forth the fundamental rights that countries had promised to protect by joining the UN, the rights that nations agreed to be the birthright of every person in the world. It might be interesting to just throw out a question and ask you to reply in the chat whether you've had a chance to explore this document before, this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Is it something you're familiar with, you've studied, maybe you've heard of, or is this something new for you? And like I was saying previously, for most of us in our country, in the United States, most of us don't have any sort of formal opportunity to explore this. So I'd be interested to hear your experience. The UDHR, the Declaration of Human Rights, it is now the cornerstone of international human rights law. It became a model for rights provisions in many constitutions the world over. It's difficult to overstate the significance of this document. And historian Sam Moyne writes in his History of Human Rights, he contends that in different ways, Christianity defined the worldview of who he calls three of the primary framers of the Universal Declaration. One was former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, Pauli Murray's friend. They had a very special friendship over many years. And Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the Human Rights Commission that drafted the Universal Declaration. Also, Charles Malik, a Lebanese Christian and professor of philosophy who had grown up in an American Protestant missionary school, loving to read the Bible. He was an intensely prayerful man. He played a very prominent part in the development of the Universal Declaration. So there were significant intellectual figures who were inspired by their Christian faith who participated in creating this document, which is not to say that it was exclusively a product of Christian thought. There were representatives from other faiths and cultures like P.C. Chang from China and René Cassin from France. But I'll leave more of that history for another time. I do want to mention that the ecumenical Christian movement was important in calling for human rights protections at the UN, played a significant role in the drafting and adoption of the Universal Declaration as it sought to address the rise of totalitarianism in the wake of World War I. A gentleman named Frederick Nold was a leader in these efforts. And he was convinced that a holistic set of human rights followed from a Christian social ethic. All of the Christian scholars who I'm bringing into the conversation today affirm that the Universal Declaration expresses the concept of human rights they explore in their writing. In other words, this important document stands in continuity with the Christian convictions that have been part of the intellectual history, along with other influences that eventually gave rise to the concept of human rights. So that's a lot about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And a few of the key principles in the Declaration are ones I've already spoken of: human dignity as the foundation for human rights, universality, these are rights for all people everywhere, and equality and non-discrimination. So right there in the first article, Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And followed by Article 2, everyone is entitled to these rights without distinction based on factors like race, color, sex, language, religion, etc., etc. So we begin to see here, through this principle of equality and non-discrimination, how human rights takes what had been previously distinctive movements for justice and liberation and unites them into one overarching framework, into one cause that today we call human rights. So recall what I said, citing Jacques Maritain, that nations of the world could agree on human rights, and they did, as evidenced in the Universal Declaration, but they could not agree on the deeper why. And that's what we're exploring today, the deeper why. And Professor David Gushee, who I'm going to rely on in this conversation, he suggests we should do, and I'm quoting, we should do our own theologically and ethically richer version in dialogue with other groups doing the same from the perspective of their faith traditions. And I would suggest that's what we're endeavoring to do today, our own theologically richer Christian understanding of a universal idea of human rights. So I would like now to turn more to Professor Gushie's scholarship and to talk about a wonderful book of his, which I've just enjoyed greatly. And I've got it on my shelf, The Sacredness of Human Life, The Sacredness of Human Life. And he develops an ethic or identifies and documents a Christian ethic of sacredness of human life. And that's what I take it Professor Gushie is pointing to is the deeper why we have human rights. And I think I understand his approach to be quite consistent, though distinctive from Wolterstorff's, whereas Wolterstorff is talking about the love of God and the focus is on that love as the source of human worth. Professor Gushie is quite focused on the human person herself, the human being, and the sacredness of human life that is attested to in Scripture, and that does, yes, emanate from, originate with God the Creator. So let me say more about this. He presents what he calls a paradigm of sacredness. In other words, what does it mean to say something is sacred? Let's just start there. Well, it means a few things. He suggests it means this sacred thing is set apart. It's special. It's special. And secondly, it's set apart by someone who has the authority to designate it as such, and whose authority is going to be respected in the community. And third, there's a good reason to set it apart and call it sacred. And fourth, to set it apart as sacred, this evokes in us a sense of awe or reverence, a sense of veneration or honor. And fifth, as a result, this gives rise to a moral obligation to treat the sacred object with due respect, even with special care, he says, to prevent desecration of that which is sacred. And finally, as a result, we have violations for violating what is sacred. So that's what he's bringing into this conviction of sacredness. He then goes on to say that Christian faith, Christian religious belief, has a long tradition stretching back to the Hebrew and Christian scriptures of regarding all human life as sacred. And this is a significant contribution, he argues, of faith to the broader human rights, the development of human rights historically. To say that all human life, not just some human life, is sacred, that's a very important claim, and that's foundational to saying all people have human rights. It's an ancient idea, a core belief of the church, which is different, let's be clear, from saying that the church always lived up to this ideal. We know the history is much more mixed than that. And also Gushie doesn't shy from that at all in his treatment. I'm just not expounding on that so much right now. But in essence, the idea is there's an ancient Christian tradition of belief that all human life is sacred. So, like I said, similarly to Wolterstorff, Gushie sees God as the ultimate source of this sacredness. God as the originating impetus for placing a special value on human life. God, and this is a quote, God has consecrated each and every human being without exception in all circumstances as unique, incalculably precious being of elevated status and dignity. This means we must assume a posture of reverence and accept responsibility to respect the sacredness of human life, to show due care. We have an obligation to even protect human life and to foster human flourishing. And I especially respect the consistency with which Professor Gushee applies this across a full spectrum of social and political concerns. So I want to pause here because we've so far introduced two major ideas within Christian thought that justify why human beings have this special worth entitling them to certain human rights. First, we looked at the love of God and how that love is an honor, and that honor bestows worth on each one of us. And now we're looking more intensively at the idea that in Christian thought, every human being is sacred, and that demands something of all of us in terms of how we treat one another. You know, I can't help but think of the pandemic that our nation continues to struggle through. I want to say my prayers, our prayers at Justice Revival, are with everyone being affected deeply. For you in the South, I mentioned earlier, that's my home region. All my kin are in North Florida and South Texas. And so it's been painful to see the disregard for human life exhibited by some of the leaders. I'm speaking of the governors of those two states. And I don't mind just stepping out to say that in my estimation, that's a pretty clear violation of this sacredness ethic. If we believe life is sacred, and that gives us a moral obligation, a duty to protect it against desecration and violation, my goodness, some basic public health measures should be the least we can do in order to live into this. So, sacredness of human life. Now, I know your ears may have perked up because, and Gushee discusses this at length in his book, we're used to hearing this ethic maybe applied very narrowly and selectively to particular issues. But the sacredness of life ethic, akin to human dignity, is to be applied universally. It is to be applied universally. It doesn't just apply to particular issues. I'm remembering again my pastor, the late Laird Stewart, who I mentioned earlier. I learned so much from him, but at our church in San Francisco at Calvary, I remember clearly one day when he preached as part of the Sunday sermon that really every social political issue we touch is a moral issue. And I remember him at the time saying, how we treat the environment is a moral issue. How we spend our money is a moral issue. And that rung true to me because I grew up in a different stream or tradition of the Christian church in the US South. And so I grew up in an environment where claims of morality would have been kind of narrowly attached to particular social issues. But no, Gushee's talking about sacredness of life, this being a consistent ethic that informs what we do across issues. I want to talk a little bit about what it means to apply this sacredness ethic to the lives of women and gender minorities, the LGBTQ community, because I think we're less accustomed to applying that framework in this way. I don't know how often we hear this approach. And I think to apply this ethic to women, so my professional background has focused primarily on gender-based rights violations. And so this is an area that I probably know the most about. And I would suggest that applying an idea of sacredness of life to women's lives is to counter a core fallacy, even a heresy, that was too long part of church teaching, the idea that full humanity, being made in the image of God, was attributed only to males for many centuries in the church. And women were considered not to reflect that divine image to the same measure or extent. And this, of course, was an incredible transgression. We read the first page of the Bible, Genesis 1:27, in the image of God, God made them, male and female, God made them. We can see that it's just a wrong-headed idea. We continue to reckon with the impact today in terms of injustice, just as we reckon with the impact of racial subjugation and apartheid that some sought to justify based on the Bible. Denying the sacredness of human life, of any group of humans, leads to violence and oppression. And let me just give you a bit of a picture of how it looks for women here in the United States. 1 in 3 have experienced either rape, physical violence, stalking by an intimate partner. 1 in 5 women in the US have experienced rape in their lifetime. We have the highest maternal mortality rate in the developed world. One of the leading reasons women die during pregnancy or the postpartum period is homicide. The rate of homicide doubles for young women when they're pregnant or have just had a baby. Lord have mercy. I could tell you more stories. I'll just name a few of the other forms of gender-based injustice that are concerns from a human rights perspective. Pregnant women who are trying to hold a job face discrimination, and the Supreme Court has said facing discrimination based on pregnancy, that's not sex-based discrimination. If that makes no sense to you, you're not alone. Justice Brennan said, surely it offends common sense to think discrimination based on pregnancy has nothing to do with sex. And we all know the US is the only high income country that doesn't afford some paid parental leave, which is part of what contributes to our high maternal mortality rate. And finally, consider how the entrenched racism and sexism intersect with grave effect, because Black women in our country die from pregnancy and childbirth at 3 to 4 times the rate of white women. I'm reminded of Pauli Murray's words that she wasn't sure why she was being discriminated against. And at that point, how would one know, and really, how would it really matter? Because the results are equally as grave, whatever the source. I could go on. Child marriage, hundreds of thousands of young women and girls below the age of 18 married in this country. In all of these ways, our society fails to honor the sacredness of women's lives, as it sadly too often fails to honor the lives of Black and Indigenous people, of other people of color, as it fails to honor the lives of people who don't conform to our traditional expectations about gender or sexuality. And yet, the sacredness of life the sacredness of human life, the value of our lives in light of God's love, that is for each of us. That is for all of us. And that is the foundation of human rights. That's why I believe as Christians, when we know what the source of human rights are in our tradition, it should be easy for us to affirm. We should be the first willing to step forward to affirm, yes, human rights are for everyone equally without discrimination. Yes, because the love of God, it's for all of us, poured out for all of us. Because being made in the image of God, that extends to all of us without exception, without qualification. And so if these rights rest on that foundation, yes, they're for all people all the time, regardless of all of the beautiful things that make us unique and different from one another. But our nation has been remarkably reticent to embrace equality, regardless of gender, even in principle, let alone in practice. And that, as I mentioned earlier, is unfortunately part of the legacy of bad theology. So women were excluded from the basic framework of the US government from the beginning in our Constitution. And after the Civil War, when citizenship rights were extended to formerly enslaved men through the Reconstruction Amendments, women of all colors were excluded. When some women claimed the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, applied to them in those early post-war decades, they lost their cases in court. They were not permitted to be lawyers or serve on juries. And it's only in the last 5 decades, through tireless advocacy, that women have gradually, on a case-by-case basis, been extended or earned some measure of equal protection before our Supreme Court, but not in the unequivocal or holistic or systematic way that human rights would warrant, or that our Christian framework for human rights we're building today would warrant. Always with a lesser, murkier standard for gender, applied with the sort of implicit bias that would give pregnancy discrimination a pass. To embrace women as equally sacred alongside men, to embrace all people as equally sacred of any gender, it requires taking the claim of equal human worth and equal human rights seriously. And here is, I think, the most important idea that I'm sharing with you today. So if you write down or you grab hold of one idea, I hope it'll be this one. If our human rights follow from the sacredness of human life, if they're justified by the sacredness of human life, if they're justified by the profound worth that God grants us through God's love, then to deny those rights is to repudiate or to disbelieve that group's sacredness or that group's condition of being loved by God. You see, if we understand those Christian foundations of our rights, we have to really take seriously the violations of those rights, because it is offending in quite a heretical way the core of our belief, the core of our gospel, that God loves and comes to each of us, that each of us is valued as a child of God. Human history, I'm sorry to say, is replete with stories from every corner of the globe of all the creative ways women's dignity has been denied. We're very focused, and with good reason, on women's rights in Afghanistan right now. We should be. And also we should be mindful of how violations there connect to subjugation of women here and everywhere. We're not immune. Historically, globally, it's been the subjugation of women that has been an organizing principle, much more so than gender equality or human rights. But friends, this has changed over time, and it can change if we decide we want to change it, if we hear God asking us to change it. So I want to just kind of cap this lecture by talking to you about a very hopeful sign and something that brings me great encouragement. I think we have an historic, once in a lifetime opportunity to implement a fundamental human rights reform that affirms and proclaims the sacred worth, the sacredness of the lives of women and of people of every gender and sexual orientation. And that is a very basic human rights reform is our opportunity. It's the Equal Rights Amendment. Some of you may know of it from the first phase of this movement in the 1970s. And here today, there is somewhat miraculously an opening, an opportunity to finalize the Equal Rights Amendment started nearly 50 years ago. It is such a simple reform. It says equality of rights under law shall not be denied or abridged on the basis of sex. And I hope after the few hours we've spent together already that I think you can easily hear why that is such a basic notion of human rights. Simply equality under the law for all of us. It's elemental if we take seriously this concept of human rights, this universal declaration of human rights. Most countries in the world have a provision like this in their constitution. I think there's only 25 countries that don't. All constitutions written since World War II have such a provision. We're part of a small minority that doesn't. 26 states in the United States have an Equal Rights Amendment in their state constitution. This would provide equal citizenship to all Americans, which could not be undone no matter who is in the White House or who is sitting on the Supreme Court. So it's important to declare that all people are sacred, that women are sacred too, because this truth was long disbelieved and denied by so many, and too often in the name of our own Christian faith. Reverend Dr. Polly Murray called the case for the ERA unassailable. Today, one of the foremost leaders to ensure the ERA is finalized and ratified is Nevada State Senator Pat Spearman, who herself is also an ordained minister and a retired Army officer, a lieutenant colonel. So she successfully led the effort for Nevada to ratify the state ERA. And she is one of many women of color leading this struggle. I would say in each of the states who've recently ratified, at the fore of those movements have been Black women lawmakers. The ERA makes a meaningful, unequivocal statement that equality is a national value and that all people deserve constitutional protection. And I think the most important reason we need it is because it stands in opposition to an unjust ideology. There is a persistent opposition, much of it religiously based, to the ERA. And I think this existence of the opposition is problematic in itself because it reveals how much human equality is still not universally accepted, much less embraced. And so often our struggles to realize human rights and greater justice they do boil down to this: whether we actually believe we are all equally sacred, equally valuable because of the love of God poured out on us, and whether that equality before our Creator God in heaven does not also mean some fundamental level of equal dignity and regard from the man-made state. Those are the classic questions that have been at issue in so many struggles for liberation, so many struggles against injustice throughout history. Does our spiritual equality in heaven not mean some measure of fundamental equality on earth? Does it not include all of us? Friends, I think I'll conclude by saying that all of the bases of human rights we're examining today, I believe, point to an answer of yes. They all affirm that yes, we all deserve to enjoy human rights equally. And in fact, I believe if we do base our natural human rights on the foundations that these Christian scholars have offered, it is, to my estimation, not possible to develop some outworking of rights that disadvantage or denigrate or lessen the rights of any group. That's my big audacious claim, and I think I will stop there for now. And if you have questions, I'll be delighted to entertain those.
Thank you, Allie. We had some carryover questions from lingering from the first presentation. If that's okay, we could perhaps start there. We had a question from Sarah Jean that asks if you are familiar with the concept of public theology, defined as engaging the ways in which a church exists in and for the world, and what you might be able to offer between the connections with human rights and public theology.
Fantastic. Yes, I know this concept, though I can't claim that I'm an expert in it, but it's certainly closely related. So to the extent public theology addresses who we are as a church and as Christians in relation to our public institutions and policies, what we believe about human rights and how that informs our justice activism is going to be closely interrelated with how we speak to our public square and how we call on our public institutions to respond. And I'll just mention the Office of Public Witness of our denomination in Washington, D.C., and Jimmy Hawkins, who leads that office, and they do phenomenal work kind of leading our denomination's advocacy work. And I think that is another kind of practical place where we can engage our public theology and our activism for human rights.
Great, thank you. I had a question from John. What is the main reason that America has not gotten past our racist history? What are we holding on to?
That is a profound question. I can't claim to have the answer, certainly, but I can offer one thought on white supremacy. I don't think it is a psychological error in the way of ego or self-aggrandizement. This might seem counterintuitive, but I think it's exactly the opposite. I think white supremacy comes from a deep self-loathing fear of not being worthy, and so needing to step on the head of another in order to try to grab on to something to fill that sort of deep kind of empty well of not feeling worthy and not sensing belonging. And so that's why, to me, it is very much a theological response that's needed. Also in relation to the oppressor. I'm not saying step back from justice. I think you all know me too well for that by now. But I think these kind of hierarchies, um, they're a problem that comes when we don't know what our true worth really is in God and in Christ.
Thank you. And Bonnie asks, what suggestions do you have to help continue to address these various issues at a local level as we move forward?
Oh, that's a great question, Bonnie. That's a really important question. Well, I mean, one thing that I can offer is I hope you will connect with Justice Revival and that we can be partners in some of your work for justice. I should have mentioned this earlier on. So, our mission at Justice Revival is inspiring, educating, and mobilizing Christian communities like St. Philip to be engaged in the movement for human rights. And so, one of the ways we do this is through various advocacy campaigns that we support and that you can be a part of through various calls to action. For instance, you saw Philonis Floyd's testimony. Justice Revival was one of the many civil society organizations that pressed for the urgent UN meeting where he had that opportunity to testify. So we try to raise awareness about some of those avenues for advocacy and give people a chance to be involved. Similarly, right now, Justice Revival is leading a campaign for the ERA, the Faith for ERA campaign that a dozen organizations and over 500 faith leaders have already signed on. And at our website, there's lots of information about that and ways to be involved. But I hope you'll sign up for our mailing list and stay connected. And then we also point to a lot of our partner organizations that we work with on all of these issues. And so on social media, et cetera, we're often lifting up the work of others, many others doing good work in these areas as well.
We had a question from Lori. How does the sacredness of life ethic extend to care for the environment?
Oh, excellent question. And if we were together in one room, I would ask you, Lori, what you think, because I imagine you already have some clear ideas about that. But certainly, especially in light of the latest report we've heard from the UN panel, we know that what's happening to our environment has incredible consequences that bear on the sustainability of human life. And so it's absolutely, we are seeing it's ultimately vital that we protect and care for the planet in order to protect the life that's here, but also the well-being, as we see more and more in our own country and elsewhere, people being really burdened with some of the ill effects of climate change already in the form of natural disaster and extreme weather. And my prayer is just we could just be honest with what it is we need to do or what bit we need to sacrifice in order to protect this beautiful world God has made for us.
Thank you. Probably time for another question or two before we take an extended break. But Orlean asks, what do you believe causes knee-jerk reactions from those who refuse to examine the issues of human rights, who do not see it from the point of view from the victim, or perhaps see this as an issue of sacred human life? And how do we talk to our neighbors about these issues?
I think the causes run deep. In my experience, I would say it's the way folks have been educated, the media folks are exposed to, and the social soup we're all immersed in in terms of the kind of various prejudices that have really been stoked over the last 4 or 5 years through the previous presidential administration, and have really become more overt and blatant. So I think these are deep, obviously deep forces. And in terms of speaking to folks, again, not that I'm an expert on this. In fact, your pastor probably would be the one to offer more insight. But I understand that trying to listen first, trying to hear what the other person values. Do they value a sense of patriotism? Do they value a sense of security and safety? Do they value ensuring that their family has enough? Trying to hear that value, respect it, and then find a way to some degree you can affirm or identify with that. And usually talking to them through a story is what I understand is effective. A story from your own experience about what you've seen. That's usually the way to reach people more than an analytic argument.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more, and those of you whose questions have not made it to the forefront yet, we will have time later for sure. But this might transition us into our next segment. But what relationship exists between human rights, or perhaps the lack thereof, and the rise of nationalism?
That's a great question. That is actually previewing something to come in the next hour. So in the third hour, we're going to talk about the migrant family separation scandal in the United States. We're going to talk about the human rights violated there. And part of the lecture will be on nationalism, including religious and Christian nationalism, as a force that cuts against our respect for human rights.
Great, thank you, Allie. Yeah, it's a perfect segue, or we'll pause right there, if you will, and